G'day, Justin Hogg here from Right Source, talking the great outdoors. On a little bit of a different topic. We're definitely talking in the governance sphere, but today I wanted to talk about accounting and perceiving it as a language as opposed to, I suppose, a process. Now, when people who aren't experienced, and for full disclosure, I am an accountant by trade, so this might be a little bit different. And I suppose my time as an accountant and working in the accounting industry, you start off that process learning that, there's all these rules that you have to follow, and accounting is all about rules and following the process and standards and these type of things. And then you accept that. And most people who aren't accountants, that's the message they get, and accept that as well. Most people accept that. As you work through, I suppose, working in different organizations, and sometimes different organizations that do very similar things, you actually see, for some reason, accounting in one organization is very different to the accounting in another organization. Now, initially it's very hard to understand, and maybe you just go, well, one organization maybe know what they're doing, the other doesn't. Maybe that's a reason. But as I've worked through my career, what I found is that it's not about necessarily an organization being good and one being poor. They're just applying it differently. Now, how can something that is rules-based be applied differently? And I think this is where a lot of people think of accounting, because it's numbers, they think of it as math. So when you're thinking about maths, 1 + 1 = 2, always. There is no room for movement there. There's structure and there's outcomes, and it can be calculated and defined. And that's mathematics. If you look at accounting more like a language, well, language, so like English, for example, there's the written word, there's the spoken word. They're very different. They're based on the same rules, the same guidelines, but they're very different in how they come across. If you go to texting, again, that's very different again, but it's all the same language. It's all based on the same rules. And language is about creating meaning. And I think when you start looking at accounting about creating meaning, then it's about how do you use accounting to paint a picture, to create meaning for someone who's looking at it, not necessarily about keeping score. If you look at then accounting as a language, languages are used to tell stories and to communicate, but what is it communicating? They're communicating meaning. And so a story is about communicating meaning. So if you then look at accounting as a way to communicate meaning or a way to tell your story, this is a very different way to look at it, because now you're not looking at, and especially in terms of the learning process, when you're trying to learn accounting in terms of how can I use it to convey a story, as opposed to how do I learn it to know the rules, it's a very different way of approaching the same problem. Now, in working in the governance space, why I find this really interesting is because governance is really about aligning people with purpose. So it's creating that alignment. And the best way to create alignment with people is through story, is through bringing people along on a journey. And that ability to tell a story is what helps create that alignment. And when you create alignment in organizations and alignment to purpose, that's when you really see success. Now, definitely there's ways we can do that in storytelling and social media, but if we also use accounting to do that as well, it's just another medium that we can use to reinforce the story that we're telling to create that alignment in organizations. Now, when I talk with CEOs and especially founders about understanding their numbers, and when we come at it from, let's not worry about what the accounting, I don't need people to know what the accounting standards are. It's about how do we make the numbers on the page, on the numbers that you present, on the story that you tell with those numbers, how do you make it your story? How do you make it consistent with what you believe the organization is performing, and that it's the story of that organization? When you work with people that allows that to happen, then it becomes their story. And I think that's what's really important with anyone working with an accountant or working with numbers, is that it's not the CFO, it's not the accountant's story, it's your story. It needs to be telling your story. If it's telling your story, you own it, and what you'll see as an organization is the organization will begin to own it, because it will become their story as well. It can't become their story unless it's your story. As the leader, it needs to be your story, and that way it permeates the organization. The other thing that's interesting with that approach is when you're dealing with people, or if you aren't particularly financially savvy, it allows people to learn the language of accounting. So when you're learning the language of accounting, you learn to speak it, you learn to understand it, and the story that it's telling. And I suppose my experience in teaching people through this mechanism of learning accounting as a language is people who are really in fields that had nothing to do with math or accounting have become really good at being able to talk and tell the story of accounting and tell the story in numbers and understand it. And the last thing that happens with this, not only as a CEO do they become able to express their language to the board sees the meaning and the story of the organization sees the story, but then it allows you to read others' stories. So once you understand the language of accounting and you can see the story that's being told, you can then see other people's stories as well. So it opens up a whole new world. Now, I do think looking at learning accounting as a language does help you learn it quicker. It doesn't make it easy. Learning any language isn't easy. So if you're wanting to learn, if you speak English and you want to learn Spanish, that's not necessarily easy. But if you're learning it immersively, so if you're learning the language to try and communicate, you learn it quicker and you understand the way to use it to communicate. Whereas whether you're just trying to understand the rules of the language, it doesn't help you learn how to communicate. So I think that's the whole point, is that if you're learning to use something as a communication process, it makes it easier. There's still definitely a process and there's still definitely commitment that you require to get there in terms of learning the new language. So that's something a bit different in terms of accounting as a language and really looking at it in a different context that I hope you found interesting. Thanks for watching the video today. We've got other videos on accounting, but also on not-for-profit and governance on our YouTube channel, so feel free to check those out. Again, thank you for taking the time to watching the video today. It's been Justin Hung from RightSource.